I know that some of your research has focused on the history of the relationship that Canada has with Korea in particular. How would you describe that relationship and its importance?
So Canadian-Korean relations go way back to the 1880s when a first group of missionaries were sent from the University of Toronto. And from that point onwards, it's an extremely positive and flourishing relationship. So the missionaries did a lot of cultural activities ranging anywhere from translating the Bible to coming up with the first ever Korean English dictionary to even building hospitals and schools. And one missionary in particular, Dr. Schofield, is famous for fighting with the Koreans for Korean independence under Japanese colonial rule. So they set the foundation for the future relationships to come. And Canada participated in the late 1940s in the UN Temporary Commission on Korea to supervise the elections. And when the Korean War broke out in June 1950, Canada became the third largest troop committing country at the time, which was very significant. And then from that point onwards, the relationship flourished in terms of immigration and trade because Korean economy also took off around the 1960s and 70s.
So most of the focus now for many countries in the Asia-Pacific region does focus on trade and economic issues. But at the same time, obviously, there's huge strategic difficulties, particularly in the Korean Peninsula now. How has the uncertainty around the political situation in South Korea, how does that affect the relationship?
It has actually significant implications for Canadian interests. So in terms of why we should care about Canadian-Korean relations today, the first reason comes from commercial interests. Canada and Korea signed the first ever free trade agreement in January 2015, which is our first free trade agreement in the region. And it also opens up our market in terms of what South Korea has to offer. So South Korea is the 11th largest economy in the world and the 4th largest one in Asia. And it has a population of 50 million people. So in addition to an expanded market for Canadian businesses, the cpac.ta opens up doors for the greater Asia-Pacific region in general, which I think is very important for Canada's future strategic interests. And because of our involvement in the Korean War, Canada has very vested interests in terms of peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula.
Given the political instability, what do you worry about most as you watch, in South Korea now particularly, watch that story unfold?
I think actually there's a lot to be hopeful about because uncertainty is a very short-term phenomenon. In democracies, we see a lot of scandals, political and economic nature happen from time to time, but resilient societies do bounce back. So what we saw with the latest crisis in Korea was that a very robust public participation through protests, in addition to very important roles played by the judiciary and the legislature, led to the outcome that we see today. So I think moving forward, there's a lot of opportunities for Canada and Korea to collaborate in terms of promoting peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula and further exploring our commercial and economic interests in the region.
Put North Korea in the picture for me now, because clearly that's a real concern and a real flashpoint, and it seems to be deteriorating to some degree. You've said in the past that you think that Canada should play more than just an observer role in terms of that crisis. What do you think Canada should do?
I think there's a lot that Canada could do to meaningfully engage with North Korea. So Alison, when we look at North Korea, we have very significant problems that are very different. So on the one hand, we have a North Korean regime using rhetoric and also investing a lot of energy on nuclear weapons, missiles, hydrogen bombs, you name it. So that's a real threat for the international community on all levels. But on the other hand, we shouldn't forget the humanitarian crisis that's happening in North Korea. So Justice Michael Kirby with the UN Commission of Inquiry, for instance, found out that there are crimes against humanity being committed in North Korea on a daily basis.
What can Canada do?
So in that case, I think Canada could engage diplomatically with future negotiations. I think we'll see a much more conciliatory approach coming out of South Korea in terms of its engagement with North Korea. So on mediation and diplomacy, there's a lot for Canada to do. And even on humanitarian aid, considering that millions of North Koreans are dying from hunger, malnutrition, to just name a few, there's a lot more that Canada could do rather than just sort of watching it as a bystander. We have a lot of expertise because Canada has a long-standing history in terms of promoting global humanitarianism.
But doesn't it mean that that country has to be willing to accept that humanitarian aid on some level? Isn't it difficult to even get past that barrier to be, even if countries wanted to contribute in a humanitarian fashion?
I think you raise a good point in terms of the willingness to accept, but on humanitarian aid, North Korean regime is generally open. We have been more engaged in the past. If you look at Canada's record of humanitarian engagement with North Korea, the Harper government was not so willing to engage at all with North Korea, but we're seeing certainly a change in tone with the Trudeau government. And I'm hopeful that beyond just criticizing North Korea, that we actually take some time to find ways in which we could promote freedom from fear and freedom from want, which are very interconnected issues when we look at the future of our foreign policy with regards to North Korea, and take steps so that we move beyond just what we see in terms of rhetoric.
Thank you very much.